So before we dive into actually learning how to use the Dart programming language to later use the Flutter framework to create applications, I want to get a brief overview of how these Dart programming language ideas connect to the Flutter framework. So let's take a step back and try to think about the problem they're actually trying to solve. What happens when you want to develop an application? For example, let's say you have a great new company idea, maybe something like a ride sharing application using mobile phones, but then you realize your users could be on different devices. So some of your users are going to be on iPhone, which means you need to learn how to develop for iOS using something like the Swift programming language. And you also have users running Android phones. That means you need to learn how to do things like develop with Java or Kotlin. And then perhaps maybe some people are actually even using things like a website. That means you're going to need to learn how to use HTML, CSS, and more importantly, JavaScript to actually get your application to run on the website. And maybe you even need desktop applications. So in this case, what happens when you want to create one application but have it across different devices? One solution is to develop a native application in the codebase for each target device. That means you would have one codebase in something like Swift for iOS devices, then another codebase in something like Java or Kotlin for Android devices. And then for your web application, you would develop a similar codebase, but this time it's in JavaScript. Now that means you need to hire many more engineers, and unfortunately, that means you also need to maintain many more different code bases. So of course you're probably wondering, there's gotta be a better way. Could we just code once and then deploy to multiple screens or multiple devices? Well, that's exactly the type of problem that the Flutter framework is trying to solve. Flutter is an open source framework by Google for building natively compiled multi-platform applications from a single codebase. In other words, you code once and then can deploy an app for any screen, whether it's iOS, Android, web, and even desktop applications with the newest versions of Flutter. Now notice how I said Flutter is a framework. That doesn't actually mean that Flutter itself is a language. Flutter is a framework that's built using the Dart programming language. So Dart is a programming language developed by Google. Flutter is a framework developed for the Dart programming language. And as will become clear later on in the course, the two teams that are working on both Dart and the other team that's working on Flutter are working very closely together. So I would say like 99.999% of all people learning the Dart programming language are learning it because they want to actually use the Flutter framework. So Dart is definitely centered towards building things for a front-end interface. So Dart is the foundation of Flutter, and it provides the language and runtimes that power the Flutter applications. But it should be noted that Dart also supports many core developer tasks like formatting, analyzing, and testing code. Now, a couple of details on the Dart programming language, and these are kind of more specific details if you're coming in from another development application language. Dart is an object-oriented language and is strongly typed. Its syntax takes elements from C# and JavaScript, so it's kind of like a combo between those two. And it really focuses on the front end, which makes a lot of sense given it's kind of built as the foundation of Flutter. Now, a couple of more specific features, and don't worry if you don't understand these, we'll discuss these in more depth as we learn Dart, but it should be noted that the Dart language uses static type checking to ensure variable's value matches its static type. It also has optional type annotations due to type inference. It offers sound null safety, meaning values can't be null unless specified, and we'll have a whole discussion about null safety in Dart later on. And it also protects against null exceptions through static code analysis. So how does this actually work? Essentially, Dart's compiler technology lets you run code in different ways, and there's really two main ways of doing this. There's the native platform. Essentially, you're going to be writing within the Dart programming language, and then you'll use the Dart platform and the native platform for that aspect in order to target things like mobile and desktop devices. So Dart includes both a Dart VM with a just-in-time compilation and an ahead-of-time compiler for producing machine code to run on these different devices. So those are things like trying to get your Dart programming language code to run on both an Android phone or a iPhone phone. Now, what happens if you want to develop a web application? That means technically any device could visit your URL and then see your website and web application. Well, Dart programming also has a web platform. So these are for apps targeting the web. Dart can actually compile for development or production purposes. And if you've ever done any web development, then you realize all it's essentially doing is it's actually a web compiler that translates the Dart programming language into JavaScript, which then allows your web application to be read by things like internet browsers. So if we were to visualize this, essentially what the Dart platform allows you to do, it allows you to ship to Dart native, essentially different types of architectures that run on different phones. So something like an iPhone or an Android phone or a desktop application like a Mac OS desktop application. Or what you can also do is have the Dart web platform and then ship things into JavaScript. Now, that's kind of an interesting idea because that means you could first kind of test the waters by just developing a web application with Dart. And then when you decide, hey, I actually want to start shipping this to other devices, not just a web application, then you can also use Dart native platform. Well, the reason that's nice is because technically many different types of devices like an iPhone or Android or just a MacBook, those can all visit the web and use a web application. So there is sometimes the temptation to just use JavaScript and just get a web application out there and have all these different devices end up using it. Well, what you could do instead is try to hedge your bets and develop a web application, but do it with Dart as the deep foundation that eventually gets compiled into JavaScript. That way, in the future, if you ever decide, hey, I actually want to develop native applications, then you could use that Dart codebase to start shipping with Dart native. Now, what does this actually mean for you that is the developer who's going to learn Dart and later use the Flutter framework? Well, essentially what you're going to do is you're first going to learn the Dart programming language. We're going to cover things like just variable types, how to do things like control flow in code. So think things like if-else statements in Dart, for loops in Dart. We'll have a couple of exercises, and we really want to build a strong foundation with the Dart programming language. Then we'll introduce the Flutter framework. The Flutter framework is going to be a set of tools, specifically things like widgets, that allow you to easily create applications that you can then decide to deploy to native phones. For example, you can go to an iPhone or an Android tablet or a desktop application, etc. And again, Flutter uses things like UI widgets. Now, it should be noted that Dart is a programming language. That means if you really wanted to, you could use the Dart programming language to develop your own front-end widgets. So you could create your own custom UI widgets. However, most people end up using the same sort of widgets. For example, most people are going to use buttons. So there's no need to try to develop your own specific type of button. Instead, you'll use Flutter with its own button widget, and then you'll start customizing it to your own needs. So we won't actually have the need to create things custom with Dart in regard to creating applications for things like native devices. Instead, Google's already done the work for us with this Flutter framework. So that means as a course, we're first going to focus on learning the Dart programming language. Then we're slowly going to introduce the Flutter framework via projects that we build. Now, we highly recommend that you don't just jump straight into Flutter. We really recommend that you learn the Dart programming language first. It can be extremely tempting to just go straight into Flutter and start developing cool applications. But there's going to come a point where you start getting lost or confused because you didn't eat your vegetables, so to speak, in order to learn the Dart programming language, which is why we're really going to focus on getting you a great solid foundation with Dart, and then you'll be able to build a lot of cool applications when we learn the Flutter framework. Okay, let's get started. I'll see you at the next lecture.